Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We are live. First of all, I apologize for the lack of tables today. We are already setting up for Purim, and we moved all our tables next door. So, yeah. Maybe we could take, you know what? You want to go in that room, take out, there's just another small square table. We'll get one more.
Just cozy.
Yeah. It looks like we need a little more room. Yeah, okay, perfect. So we have one more table. Perfect. Thank you so much. I didn't realize I was there. So welcome to the class titled 4 Dimensions of Purim. As I told you at the very beginning that we're going to try and explore Purim from a perspective that can encompass all of the different levels of the Torah that we talked about. So there's actually 6, we call it the 4 dimensions, but there's really 6 dimensions that we talked about. The first dimension is the biblical source of Purim. The second one is the Talmud, the Medrash. Then there's the halachic aspect of Purim, halacha, the law, Jewish law. Then you have Musar, philosophy, and Kabbalah, which we're also putting together with Hasidus. Now, truth to be told, if I were to give you a class on the Megillah, I could literally give this class without exaggeration on every single verse of the Megillah. Megillah is arguably the biblical source with the most commentary on it. There's so much commentary on the Megillah, and you could literally have a class on every single verse of the Megillah. That's how much information there is out there on the Megillah. There's, of course, an entire tractate in the Talmud just dedicated to studying the Megillah. And so there is so much to do. We're going to focus on a few aspects of the story which tie into each other. And in order to do so, first of all, everyone get a Megillah booklet and a paper. So each one should have a booklet and a copy. So in order to understand the story, we can't explore the different dimensions of the Megillah until we get a little bit of a picture of what the story is. Now, I know some of us have heard the story. Okay, everyone's good? You want breakfast? You could get something to eat. There's a lot of aspects of the story which are misconstrued or different opinions and different views on it, and we take for granted a certain way of what the story is. I want to take a look at the very beginning of the story. Page number 8, chapter 1. Vayhi b'mei Achashverosh is how is how the story starts, and it was in it translates here, and it came to pass, and it was in the days of Achashverosh. So first of all, who was Achashverosh? He was a king. No, Persia. Now he was in Anstra. He came in a chain of kings from after Nebuchadnezzar. Well, Iran today. Persia is Iran. Yes. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the same people as they were then. Yeah. So Iran definitely comes up again. What? In Hebrew it's Achashverosh. Yeah. Achashverosh, it translates to here. I mean, that's most likely that wasn't the Iranian way to pronounce it. But basically, we have to understand the timeline of when this takes place. It's very important. This takes place about 70 years after the destruction of the temple. Now, the reason it's important to understand when this took place is because the entire first chapter of the Megillah is dedicated to a party when the Megillah goes into great detail about this party. Verse number 2, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which was Shushan the capital, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast for all his officials and his servants, the army of Persia, Media, the nobles, the officials of provinces being present. And he displayed the riches of the glorious kingdom and the honor of the splendorous majesty in many days. And the Megillah goes into details about exactly how it was set up and all the glitz and glamour of the party, which of course is not going to be today's discussion, but it's very, very interesting. The Rebbe has an interesting thought that he shared once on this, and he said that one thing you learn from Achashverosh is how you have to put all your energy to whatever your capabilities are. If your capabilities is to make a 180-day party with all the glitz and glamour, then you have a responsibility to do so. The 180-day party. If you have a capability to do a 180-day party and you only make a 179-day party, that's not enough. So it's one lesson from the Megillah we learned. Anyway, interesting. But the reason that it's important is to understand this was Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple in the year 3319. He reigned from the year 3319 to 3363. He destroyed Nebuchadnezzar. Then his predecessor was a king named Evel Merodach. Again, that's the pronunciation. He's a Babylonian king. Belshazzar was the following king, and they were all Babylonian kings. Then the Babylonian Empire was taken over by the Persians and the Median Empire. And you had Darius, Daryavesh Hamadai in Hebrew, Darius the Mede, Cyrus, Achashverosh. And then Darius the Persian who came afterwards, and this was Esther's son. Achashverosh and Esther had a son, and he authorized that the temple be rebuilt. Now, really, the King Cyrus, who was before Achashverosh, had already authorized the rebuilding of the temple, but ultimately it was the king that came after Achashverosh who authorized the second temple to be rebuilt, which is a story in its own right. But this king Belshazzar, who was the final king of the Babylonian Empire, so he came 3 generations after Nebuchadnezzar. Now, what Belshazzar did was, he had calculated. These kings knew from the prophets. They believed in the prophets. They heard the prophecies, and they took them seriously. They took the prophecies seriously. They listened to the Jewish prophets. Back in the days, people listened to the rabbis.
We still do, Rabbi.
You still do? Okay, good. So they were told they were told that from the prophet that after 70 years, after the completion of Babylon, that God is going to remember you and return you to Israel. So he counted 70 years and it didn't happen. Problem was, he miscalculated the 70 years because he started calculating the 70 years from the first exile. There were two exiles. When the first when the first Jews began being exiled, and he began counting from the first exile. So it wasn't actually the full 70 years that the prophet was talking about. This is why you have to be careful with the numbers. Sometimes you get them wrong. And what happened? He made a big feast. Belshazzar. He took all the garments of the Kohen Gadol. We talked about it yesterday, the garments of the Kohen Gadol. And he made a big party. And that night he died. He dropped dead. So now, Haman and Achashverosh got together and said, Haman said to Achashverosh, you want to get the Jews? This is 70 years. I recalculated and look, I got it right this time. 70 years, and nothing happened. You're good, you're going to rule forever. Let's make a party. Achashverosh said, no, I can't. He says, I'm telling you, you're good. They made the calculations. And this is where this party comes. So you have to understand that when we're opening about a party, it's not just he decided to make a party. The party has very specific reason and calculations to it. The party is actually made and created in order to celebrate the destruction of the temple and the celebration of what he thought that the Jews would never be returned from the exile. And that's why this is such a significant story. What happens at the party? Vashti, they drink and they party. And to be clear, Achashverosh, he also wanted, he made a special party for Shushan as well. After the 180 days, he made another party. Okay, this is also, people get confused. You see, verse number 4. Yeah, when he displayed the riches, glorious kingdom, and the honor, resplendorous majesty for many days, 180 days. Then, and when these days were fulfilled, the king made a 7-day feast for all the people who were present in Shushan, the capital. Everything that happens in the Purim story that we know of is a second party that he made specifically for the inhabitants of Shushan. And in this, again, it goes into detail about which were even more glitz and glamour than the first one. And what it says over here is that, verse number 8, and drinking was according to the law. There was no coercion, for so the king had established for every officer of his house to do according to each man's pleasure. Who's each man's pleasure? According to, it says the Talmud, according to Mordechai and Haman. According to Mordechai and Haman. Meaning that he said, I want it to be all kosher. I want it to be a kosher party. So what was wrong? The problem was that they started believing that Achashverosh is the real deal. And this is where ultimately their life and sustenance comes from. And they said, this is it. Let's put all our faith in Achashverosh. Our future is here. Remember, 1930s, the Jews in Germany thought they started taking the hopes and prayers for the Jerusalem out of the prayers. It said, next year in Germany. Guys, we have to remember also, America is a wonderful country, but it's still not our homeland. And so, then what happens? Vashti also made a feast. Vashti was and what happens in the 7th day? Now also another very significant aspect of this Purim story is Bayom Hashvi, verse number 10, on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he told all these people, the 7 chamberlains who attended Achashverosh, to bring Vashti the queen before the king really in royal crown. Why did he want Vashti to come? So first of all, it's significant about the 7th day. What's the 7th day? Shabbos. So the 7th day already, the Megillah is already hinting out to the story that's going to happen. Why? Because the Megillah is telling you that even though The Jews essentially are sinning at this time, doing what they shouldn't be doing, but it came Shabbos, and you could already see a difference between the way they were acting and the way the others were acting. How were the others acting? They started to argue who's the most beautiful women, and this one said the Persian women are the most beautiful, and that one said the Median women are the most beautiful. Achashverosh said, none of you are right. Who's the most beautiful woman? Vashti. And the Talmud actually attests that she was one of the most beautiful women that ever lived, actually. The Talmud says that later. But what happened? She refused to come. Why she refused to come? Because she was struck with a plague. According to some, she had pimples all over her. According to others, she had a tail. But anyway, regardless of what it is, she grew a tail. Yes. Why was Vashti punished? Because she forced the Jewish maids to work on Shabbos. So her punishment came on Shabbos. What happens? Comes to the king. The king says, what should we do with him? He was very drunk. And Memuchan, verse number 16, page 11. Memuchan declared before the king the officials, not only against the king has Vashti the queen done wrong, but against all the officials for all the people in the provinces of King Achashverosh. For the queen's deed will go forth to all women, making their husbands contemptible in their eyes, and they will say, King Achashverosh said, bring Vashti before him, but she did not come. This will go along very, very well nowadays, right? And so he says to kill Vashti, and that's what happens. Now, then they send out a letters to all the king's provinces. Now this is also very significant. Verse 22. He sent letters into all the king's provinces, to each province in his own script, and to each people in his own language, to the effect that every man should rule in his own home and speak the language of his own people. That was the rule that went out. Now, one of the reasons this was important, why is it important that the Megillah tell us that Achashverosh sent out the stupid law? Because he wants you to know that when the second law went out, which we're going to read later, which was against all the Jews. So at first people said, oh, this drunkard, he sends out these dumb laws all day. It's meaningless. Achashverosh ruled basically the entire world. He was the most powerful king at the time.
Did he worship?
Yeah, he he worshipped idols, whatever. Yeah, he was like any other ruler at the time. According to some, he was very smart. According to some, very much the opposite. But regardless, he was the final say. When you talk about rulers over the entire world, there are very few kings that ruled the entire world the way he did. 127 provinces. He had. Imagine someone that literally has power. Today we can't imagine that because there's so many different countries and provinces, and everyone has their own laws and rules and regulations. But and also the idea of a monarchy doesn't really exist today. But back in the day, you had one person sitting on a throne, and he was the ruler. You had most recently you had like the Tsar, but that was just a few countries. You had Napoleon, but that was like a few countries. This is someone that, imagine the entire Europe, the entire Asia, everything under the snapping fingers of one hand. And that's why when he put out a law that he did, it affected every single Jew throughout the entire world. And it's hard for us to imagine that, but that's what it was. Then, yes.
What caused God to be angry with Vashti so much so that he inflicted her with leprosy?
So as I mentioned before, Vashti used to force the Jewish girls to work on Shabbos, slave labor, and therefore she was punished on Shabbos. Now, I'm going to start going through the rest very quickly because I want to get to the specific points that we have here. Chapter number 2 is where we're introduced to Mordechai. How were we introduced to Mordechai? Well, first the king sent out that he's looking for a new queen. He wants a new queen, and because he needs someone to replace Vashti. Meanwhile, there was a Jewish man in Shushan, the capital. His name was Mordechai, son of Yair, son of Shibim and Kish. He had been exiled from Jerusalem along with the others, and he had reared Hadassah. She is Esther, his uncle's daughter. Okay, so that's who Hadassah was and how she was related to Mordechai. Why is Hadassah Esther? We're certainly going to read that. Huh? Vashti was killed by the king, yeah. And what happens, they collect all the girls, and then eventually Queen Vashti is chosen, and she conceals her identity. Okay? I'm not going to go into detail of that story. But I do want to take a look for a second, go into your sheet. And this is interesting. And this gives a biblical source for Purim, meaning we're in the Torah. Now, remember, there's the Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. Torah, prophets, and Ketuvim. The story of the Megillah is one of the Ketuvim. It's one of the writings. Which means, as we explained in our class, that it was written with divine intervention, but it wasn't a direct divine prophecy. So where in the Torah do we find the story of Megillah? It says the Talmud in Chulin, they asked Rav Matana, from where in the Torah can one find an allusion to the events involving Esther? He replied, Vanochi, I'm going to read the Hebrew first, Vanochi haster aster panai, and I will hide aster my face on that day for all evil which they have wrought and that they have turned to other gods. This is in Deuteronomy. Moses is telling the people shortly before his death that on that day, haster aster panai, I'm going to hide my face. The word haster means hide. Now we know why Esther was called Esther, because she was about hiding her identity. The Talmud then goes on further. From where in the Torah can one find allusion to the greatness bestowed upon Mordechai? And what is the idea of Mordechai? He replied, as is written, with regard to anointing the tabernacle, which we just had, which is actually in today's Torah reading, the first parsha of Kitisa, which is today actually. And you shall take the chief spices of flowing myrrh darar, and we translate myrrh darar in Aramaic myrrh dachya, which resembles the name Mordechai. So myrrh dachya is myrrh, which is a spice that was one of the spices brought in the Holy Temple, and myrrh dachya, which is the translation of it, is like the word Mordecai. So we see a hint to Mordechai and Esther in the written Torah, the original biblical Torah. Okay? What? It's kind of far-fetched. Okay. That's why we hire them.
No, I mean, it's hard to figure that,
Okay, next. Chapter number 3. After Achar Advar Ma'ela, after these, okay, now one more important thing, I'm sorry, is verse 21. I'm going to focus just on a few verses that are significant to our discussion. Verse 21, in those days, page 15. In those days, Mordechai was sitting at the king's gate. Bigtan and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains and the guardian of the threshold, became enraged and sought to send their hand against King Ahasuerus. The matter became known to Mordechai, who told it to Esther the queen, and Esther informed the king in Mordechai's name. The matter was investigated and found to be true. They were both hanged on gallows. It was recorded in the book of Chronicles in the king's presence. This is a story that took place. Mordechai heard this story. How did he know what they were talking about? So they were talking in a different language. They spoke Persian, but they were talking another language. It's called Tarshish, which was another language, which most people did not understand. However, Mordechai understood it. Why did he understand it? Mordechai was standing there, but they didn't think that they understood what he was saying, because Mordechai was part of the Sanhedrin, which was the board of 72 rabbis, the Supreme Court, the Jewish Supreme Court. One of the things that you have to know in the Sanhedrin, you have to know many languages. Why? Because if someone's going to come and bring testimony before you, you don't want that you have to hear the testimony through a translator. So therefore, they were required to know a number of languages. And so Mordechai actually, who was part of the Sanhedrin, understood what they were saying. And therefore he was able to give over. That's why he knew, but others didn't. What did they want to do? They were upset at the king that he's keeping them up too late, that he's driving them nuts. This is literally the story. And they were going to poison him and put a poison in his water. Apparently Achashverosh was up a lot because he was having trouble because he couldn't sleep because of everything that was going on in his life. And he was constantly asking for drinks of water. And they said, he's driving us nuts, we're going to poison him and finish him off. Mordechai then sends a message. They're able to check it out. How are they able to check it out? Because they say, thank you for my water, now why don't you go drink it? Very simple. And they obviously saw what it was. Okay. Then after these things, Achashverosh promoted Haman, son of Hadassah Agagi. He sat his seat before the officers that were before him. And then the king's servants at the gate would bow down and prostrate themselves before Haman. So, for so had the king commanded concerning him. But Mordechai would not bow, not prostrate themselves. So the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordechai, why do you disobey the king's command? Now, it's important to understand, Mordechai and Haman knew each other for many years. It wasn't like this was their first meeting. They knew each other. Haman and Mordechai were once going, again, we're going to throw in a little medrash here. They were once walking together, and Haman became very thirsty. Haman didn't have anything to drink, and he didn't have anything to eat. Mordechai did. He was a good Jew. He always had food with him. So he says, I will give you to eat and drink, but how are you going to pay me? He said, I'll pay you. I'll pay you. He said, no. Here's my shoe. I want you to sign on this that you're going to be my slave forever. And that's what he did. And Haman knew this. And Haman this was always something beating in his heart. Now, Mordechai never demanded anything from him. But he knew that Mordechai is not going to now ultimately he knew that it was really about Mordechai being a Jew. But understand that they knew each other. It wasn't just a random meeting. So, and this is going to become significant later on in the story, the fact that they knew each other. So he says, why did you disobey the king's command? So he says, verse number 5, when Haman himself saw Mordechai did not bow down and prostrate himself before him, Haman was filled with wrath. However, it seemed contemptible to him to send hand against Mordechai alone, for they had told him the people of Mordechai. What happened? Haman said, why are you not bowing down to me? He says, I'm not allowed to. You have a idol dangling from your neck. And I'm not going to allow myself to bow down to that. He says, well, didn't your grandfather, Jacob, bow down to my grandfather, Esau? He says, first of all, he didn't have an idol. And second of all, you're right that Jacob and his children bowed down to Esau. But there was one exception. There was one child that wasn't yet born. Who was that? Benjamin. He said, I'm a descendant of Benjamin. My grandparents never bowed down. Anyway. So what happened? So now Haman becomes very angry. Okay, in the first month was the month of Nisan, the 12th year of Achashverosh, Pur, that is a lot, that's where the word Purim comes from. Purim means a lot, was cast in the presence of Haman from that day to that day, and from month to month, the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. That is when it came. Now, when did he begin doing this lot? He began doing this lot in the beginning of the month of Nisan. Okay? So this was now roughly 12 months later when it fell out on. Okay, because the month of Nisan is the first month, and then Adar is the 12th month. Well, he tried every month. And a heavenly voice told him it's not going to work. Tried Nisan, they said Passover is a good month for the Jews. Iyar, they count the Omer every day. Sivan, is Matan Torah, the month that the Torah is given every month. So none of the months worked. And finally it came the month of Adar, and he said, month of Adar is good. Their leader, Moses, passed away in the month of Adar, the 7th of Adar. Which is true. That's the day of Moses' yahrzeit. But it's also the day of Moses' birthday.
He died on his birthday?
Yes, he died on his birthday. So the 7th of Adar is the day that he passed, but it's also the day of his birth. So he picked the month of Adar. I mentioned to you before that there's also a mazel, like a luck in each month. The mazel of Adar is mazel of fish. So he says it's a good month, a fish, because a fish could swallow another fish. So a heavenly voice says, well, you're right, but a fish also gets swallowed by a fish as well. Okay, now this is really what I want to talk about. Verse number 8. So Haman came to Achashverosh. There's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed amongst the peoples of the provinces in your realm. Their laws are different from every other people, and they do not observe the king's laws. Therefore, it's not befitting the king to tolerate them. What was he saying? He's saying, you don't want these people. Achashverosh said, what do you mean? Of course I do. They pay good taxes, they're hard workers. Why would I not want them? He says, no, you don't realize. They're not hard workers. They take off every holiday. Comes Rosh Hashanah, I need a vacation. Comes Sukkot, I need a vacation. Passover, I need a vacation. These are your workers that you're looking for. And then he said, then he says, if it pleases the king, let it be recorded that they be destroyed. So then he said, well, what about all the taxes I'm losing? So he said, I will pay 10,000 silver talents in the hands of those who perform the duties for deposit of the king's treasures. So the king removed his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman's son, Achashverosh of Agagite, enemy of the Jews. The king said to Haman, the silver is given to you. The people also do with them as you see fit. Haman and Achashverosh said, keep your money. I don't need them. You're doing me a favor. As the Talmud says, it's like someone that has a ditch in his field and the other one has a mound in his field. The one that says to the one, they're each thinking to each other, if only I was able to fill up my ditch. One wants to get rid of the mound, one wants to get rid of the ditch. Eventually they meet each other one day. And they say, oh, okay, I'll pay you to fill up my ditch. He says, no, take it. I got to get rid of my mound anyway. Right? So this is the same thing. He says, I'll pay you to get rid of them. He says, okay, do it for free. It's all good. Now, what I want to take now I want to take a look back in our paper here. Haman said, number 2. Haman said to Achashverosh, there's a certain people scattered and dispersed among the other peoples in all provinces in your realm, whose laws are different from many of the other people who they do not obey the king's laws. And it is not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. If it please your majesty, let an edict be drawn for their destruction, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the stewards for the deposit of the royal treasury. Okay, this is a bit of a more exact translation. Says the Medrash Rabbah, Haman said to Achashverosh, there is a one people to whom it is stated the Lord is one, is asleep with his people. The word yeshno is the Hebrew word that's used here. There is, which is translated here as there is. But there are other words that could be used for there is. The Megillah specifically used the words yeshno, which could also be used as the word, which could also be translated as the word sleeping. Shena. Shena means to sleep. Shina. Yeshno comes from the word sleeping. It said Yeshno Am Echad. He was saying there is a sleeping nation to whom is stated the Lord is one. Hashem is asleep for his people. What was Haman telling Achashverosh? He's saying this is your chance. They're sleeping now. What does it mean they're sleeping? They've sinned. God no longer, God forbid, wants them. And this is your chance, Achashverosh. Get in now. Otherwise, you're going to lose this chance. You know, look what happened to your grandfather Belshazzar. He tried messing with them, and he was gone in one night. Now is their downtime. Haman was a sorcerer. He was able to see from the stars or whatever. He said, this is their downtime. Now get in, Achashverosh. This is your chance. They're sleeping now. Okay? And sure enough, he sends out this message. What was the message? Verse 14. Verse 13, page 17. Letters were sent to couriers of provinces of the king to destroy, to slay, and to exterminate all the Jews from young to old, children and women, in one day on the 13th of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. Okay. So by the way, it was the 13th of Adar, which was the original decree. We celebrate the 14th, which is the day that they rested. But it was the 13th of Adar was the decree. It wasn't that they'd be killed on Purim, by the way. So this was this was the decree. Now understand, this idea of genocide has never, aside from then, been decreed in history. This kind of genocide on the Jewish people, not even the Holocaust. Okay, the Holocaust was mostly against European Jews, German Jews, right? This was from every Jew in every province throughout the entire world. There was no such thing ever decreed. Not since then and not before then. Which is why Purim is such a significant holiday. Okay, chapter number 4. Mordechai learned that all had been done. Now I'm gonna change the translation here. Mordechai yodas kol asher nasa. Mordechai knew everything that was done. Vayikar Mordechai es begadav, and he tore his garments, and he went into the king's gate, and he called it a day of weeping, and there was great mourning amongst the Jews, and fasting and weeping and lament, sackcloth and ashes. Okay. Now, what does it mean? Mordechai knew everything that was done. So the literal translation is that Mordechai knew, right? He knew. He found out what Haman wanted to do.
Did he find it out
So-
through Esther or some other way?
It was a decree. It was a public decree.
Oh, okay, so.
It was sent to all provinces of all the land. Now the question is, for some reason, Esther didn't know, and there's a question whether Esther knew or not. But verse number 4, you see Esther's maidens came as all the chamberlains and told her about it, and the queen was greatly distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordechai and to remove the sackcloth from him who would not accept it. Then Esther summoned Hattach, who we're told was the prophet Daniel, one of the king's chamberlains who had been summoned before her, in order to tell Mordechai to learn what this is about. Anyway, so then the king he tells Esther that you need to go to the king, and she says, I can't because it's 30 days and I'm not allowed to go. Then Mordechai says to Esther, next page 19, verse 13, then Mordechai said to Esther, do not imagine in your soul that you will be able to escape the king's palace any more than the rest of the Jews. For if you persist in keeping silence at a time like this, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another place, while you and your father's house will perish, and who knows whether it is just for such a time that you attain the royal position. This is a great lesson as well. Wherever God puts a person.
I hate to go because this is so interesting.
Okay.
God's work to do.
You can listen to the recording after. Wherever God puts a person in their position, it's for that. And this is what Mordechai is telling Esther. This is your chance. This is why God put you there. He said, maybe this is why God put you there. And now you're going to back out, and now you're going to say, I can't go. And he says, besides for that, you think that you're going to survive? He says, God is going to save us. That's going to happen. God's going to save us. Question is, who's going to be the messenger? Now, I want to go back for a moment to the beginning of this chapter. Megillah 15:9. See where it says Megillah 15a9? This is from the Talmud. The Gemara returns to its explanation of the verse of the book of Esther. The verse states, when Mordechai perceived all that was done, Mordechai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went in the midst of the city and cried aloud in bitter cry. The Gemara asks, why did Mordechai say when he cried out? Rav said that Haman has risen above Achashverosh. He saw that Haman became even stronger than Achashverosh himself, and then he controlled all the affairs of the empire. Okay, which is like a more simple meaning. But Shmuel said, the upper king has prevailed over the lower king, saying this euphemistically and insulting just the opposite. In other words, it would appear that Achashverosh, the lower king, has prevailed over the higher king, God in heaven, desires good for the Jewish people. In other words, what's the Talmud saying? The Talmud is saying, Mordechai didn't just see that there was a Haman out there. Mordechai understood that there's something deeper going on. That this is not just a guy, Haman, who hates us. But when something happens down here, it's because there's something in the higher realms that's going on, affecting what's happening in this world. And the fact that this decree came down here is because of the decree in heaven. So when it says that Mordechai saw everything that was done, Mordechai was understanding in a deeper realm that there's actually something higher. There's a higher decree going on. And that's why he didn't immediately go. He also had connections to the king. He said, let's immediately get our connections and go in there and let's talk to the king and try and convince him out of this. He realized this is not about a king, this is not about Haman. This is about the lower king, so to speak, versus the higher king. And this was a decree coming from on high. And that's why he immediately said, we have to go and pray to God. And that's why Esther also said that I'm willing to go, verse 15. Then Esther replied to Mordechai, go and assemble the Jews who are found in Shushan and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night and day, and I with my maids will fast also. Thus I will come to the king that is unlawful, and if I perish, I will perish. What was Esther saying? Esther was saying that it doesn't make sense. You want to go to the king, you want to impress the king, especially when you're not supposed to come. What, you're going to fast for 3 days? That's the worst thing you can do. You're going to look tired. You're not going to look healthy. But she also understood that this is a higher decree, and she said, "If I perish, I perish," meaning that I'm going to pray and turn to God, and I know that this is God's decree. Whatever happens, happens. Now it came to pass on the third day, Esther donned royalty and stood in the inner courtyard of the king's palace, facing the king's palace. The king was sitting on the throne, and the king noticed Esther standing in the courtyard, and she found favor in his eyes. The king extended to Esther the gold scepter that was in his hand. It says the Talmud that this was a miracle that the scepter kept stretching and stretching and stretching until it reached Esther, because she was so nervous and she wasn't going to move forward. And the angel Gabriel, who was working behind the scenes, made the scepter keep stretching out towards her. King said to her, "What is it for you, O Esther the queen? What is your petition? Even if it'll be until half the kingdom, it shall be granted to you." What's half the kingdom? Which half was he not willing to give up? There's one half that he wasn't willing to give up. No, he didn't care about Shushan. I mean, he cared about Shushan, but he didn't want to give up Israel. He said, "Don't ask me to rebuild the temple." Now, ultimately, it was his son that ended up rebuilding the temple, finishing the rebuilding the temple. He says, "I'm only giving you half. You want the world? I don't care." Today, you have a UN with hundreds of countries under their jurisdiction. All that they care about is one country, Israel, right? Achashverosh said, all other countries, whatever you want, do with them. That half you ain't taking, right? Now that is a question you could ask. Well, he didn't know she's Jewish. Why was it relevant? Okay, it's a good question. Anyway, it's not for today. It's not for now. But so what does she say? "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I prepared for him." So the king commanded hasten Haman to fulfill Esther's words. So now, that day Haman went out joyful and exuberant. So then Esther came. She came. He had the feast. The king said to her, "What is your request?" And Esther said, "My request and petition, if I found favor in the king's eyes, and if it pleases the king, that what? That let king and Haman come to a banquet that I shall prepare for them, and tomorrow I'll fulfill the king's word." Tomorrow. So she made one banquet. King says, "What do you want?" She says, "I'm not going to tell you yet. Tomorrow I want another banquet with you, with the king and Haman." Now, think what's going through the king's mind now.
Why did it take her so long?
Why is it taking so long? And why?
She wanted Haman.
Why does she want Haman? Yeah, that's kind of weird. Like, I thought, you're my wife, what's going on here? This is kind of weird. Then that day Haman went out joyful and exuberant, but when Haman noticed Mordechai at the king's gate, he did not stand up, nor did he sit before him. Haman was filled with wrath at Mordechai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. He sent and summoned his wife Zeresh, such a wonderful wife. Haman recounted to them the glory of his wealth and his many sons, and all of which the king had promoted him and elevated him. Haman said, moreover, Esther the queen brought no one but myself to accompany the king to the banquet that she had prepared. And tomorrow too I'm invited. But then he said, yet all this is worth nothing to me as long as I see Mordechai the Jew sitting in the king's gate. Right? Imagine, he's talked about his riches and his wealth and his family and everything. So as long as that Jew is there, I can't sleep at night knowing that Jew is there. Right? And you wonder, where does the idea of anti-Semitism come from? Right? So what does it say to have it? Let them make a gallows 50 cubits high. In the morning speak to the king and have them hang Mordechai on it. Then accompany the king to the banquet in good spirits. So he says, make a gallows and in the morning go to the king. Now Haman made a very, very fatal mistake. And that is where this comes in. This is really what I wanted to get to in today's class. But we needed to have that whole build-up to get to this chapter number 6. So we have to know what the context is. Balayla hahu, that night, nadida shnas hamelech, the king's sleep was disturbed. Why that night?
He's probably thinking about rest.
Huh?
Probably thinking about rest.
Oh, very good. So let's see. Look inside of your paper over here where it says Esther 6:1. That night, the king sleep deserted the king, and he ordered the book of records, the annals, to be brought, and it was read to the king. Before we read about what was read, let's first read this. Mishnah teaches that 3 sages disagree about it. Okay, beginning from where does a person read the Megillah? They saw in the Brisa that there is a fourth opinion. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says one to start read on that night. Now, there's a question. So this is from the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. This is actually where this quote is from. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says that you have to begin to read the Megillah from chapter 6. Now, we don't follow the opinion of the Rashbi, but it would be nice if we had a shorter Megillah, right? But nevertheless, the concept is there. The idea is there that you begin. That there's something significant. And the halacha is, we talked about halacha, here's one halacha of many, Purim. Laws of Purim. The reader is to raise his voice when he reads the word Balayla Hahu on that night, because this relates the main miracle of Purim. On that night, this is where the main miracle of Purim takes place. So, comes the question, why is this the main miracle of Purim? So we so far have Torah, we have a lot of Medrash and a lot of Talmud, and we have Halacha and Jewish law. We still have to get to the Kabbalah, right, and Chassidus. We'll get to that soon. On that night, the king's sleep was disturbed. Let's see what happens. So he commanded to bring the book of records, the chronicles, and that they be read before the king. And it was found written there that Mordechai had denounced Bigthan and Seresh. Now, the verse over here says, that Vayimatze Chasav, and it was found written. How did he translate it here? And it was found written. What do you mean it was found written? First of all, what was found? So, the Talmud says that they open up this book of Chronicles and they find the story of Mordechai. And the king's night chamberlain there was actually one of Haman's sons. He says, I'm not reading the story about Mordechai. He's flipping the pages again. It goes right back to the story. This is again the angel Gabriel coming and flipping the pages. He says, I'm erasing the story. When he erased the story. And the story rewrote itself. And Matzeh Chazan, so he found that it was written. That's what it means. He found that it was written. What do you mean found that it was written? It was just written then. It was rewritten. That what? And then finally, Achashverosh says, what's going on? Just read me the story already. And this is what was written. Two of the king's chamberlains, the guardian of the threshold, they sought to send their hand against Achashverosh. The king said, right, so and Achashverosh and Mordechai saved them. So the king said, what honor or majesty has been done to Mordechai for this? The king attended his minister and said, nothing has been done for him. Meanwhile, the king said, who is in the courtyard? This is the middle of the night. The king's trying to sleep. And then suddenly someone is in the courtyard. Now Haman was just coming in the outer courtyard of the royal palace to speak to the king about hanging Mordechai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. Big mistake. What did his wife say? This is why you always have to listen to your wife. What does his wife say? When should you go? She said, in the morning, you go speak to the king. He couldn't wait. He had to go that night. He didn't listen to his wife's advice, and that was a fatal mistake. The king then said to him, behold, Haman stands in the courtyard. And the king said, let him enter. Haman entered, and the king said to him, what shall we do to a man whom the king desires to honor? Now what is Haman thinking? It's him, of course, right? Now Haman said in his heart, whom will the king especially want to honor more than me? By the way, this is one of the proofs that the Talmud brings down for how do we know that when Esther wrote the Megillah, that it was written with divine inspiration? Because how would you know what Haman is thinking? Now you could say, well, of course, you could figure out Haman's thinking. But anyway, it says Haman said in his heart. How would you know what's in Haman's heart? Anyway, so Haman said to the king, for the man whom he desires to honor, have them bring royal attire that the king has worn, and a horse which his king has ridden, with a royal crown placed on his head. Then let the attire on the horse be given over to the hand of one of the king's most noble officials, and let them dress the man whom the king desires to honor, and have him ride the horse through the city square, and let them proclaim before him, and this is what shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor. Now stop, let's pause for a moment. Why couldn't the king sleep? At least from most basic perspective, why couldn't the king sleep? From the simple story. What was bothering him? Esther. What was bothering him about Esther?
That she wouldn't answer the day before.
And
And she wanted to wait till tomorrow.
you said it before. Well, then why was she inviting Haman to the party? Right?
Oh.
Right? She said, I have something really, really important I have to tell you. This is so important that I had to break the 3-day rule. Right? And Achashverosh says, wow, this must be really important. Sure, let me know, up to half the kingdom. It's not, don't worry about half the kingdom. I must speak to you and Haman privately, as a private party. Okay, fine, let's do it. Let's make a party. Make a party. You know what? It's really, really important, but let's wait till tomorrow. I'm going to have another party with you and Haman together. Right? Just think for a moment. Right? Right? And so he's saying, why does she want Haman? Why is it important? Why can't you tell it to me privately? And why do you need this party with Haman? What's going on here? Huh? So now he's very nervous and he can't sleep. Again, this is from a most basic perspective of what's going on. Now it's the middle of the night, and who's showing up? Haman. He says, "Wow, this is really getting weird. This is really getting weird. I'm trying to figure out what's going on with Haman." And so what's going on in his mind? Esther and Haman want to overthrow him, right?
Oh.
Right? Esther and Haman are trying to overthrow him. That's what's going on in a monarch's mind. He's worried about his power. That's all he's worried about. Haman, and before that, he already gave Haman the ring, gave him so much power. Second, right? So now, in the middle of the night, Haman is coming, and he says, "Okay, this is very interesting." Haman says, "Achashverosh, I have to ask you something very, very important." Okay, well, 1 second. Let me ask you something first. What shall be done to a person that I would like to honor? And now what does he say? He says, give him the crown, give him the royal horse. Let him be led in the street, that everyone shall see. Now what do you think is going through Achashverosh's mind? Right? If he's thinking that he's trying to overthrow him until now, boy, now is he really thinking that? Right? Now it starts to make sense. So then, what happens? Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the tire, the horse that you have said, and do all this for Mordecai the Jew. Mordecai the Jew, what does Haman say? Mordecai? I know a lot of Mordecai. He says, no, Mordecai the Jew. He says, no, I mean, there's a lot of Jews named Mordecai. It's a common Jewish name. No, who sits at the king's gate. You know the one that I'm talking about. Do not omit a single detail of what you have suggested. What does it mean, do not omit a single detail? So as a Talmud, so basically what he said, okay, listen, Mordecai, he's a simple Jew. He doesn't need to be ridden on a horse and in front of he doesn't need everyone to see him like that. So he says, you know what? I have a great idea. Let's give Mordecai his own island. We'll build for him his own place there. He could collect his own taxes. He'll be very wealthy. He has everything he needs.
Because he's saving the two people who are trying to come. That was.
Yeah. Well. Now he has to give an answer because he told the king that the person to honor is going to be riding in a horse in the streets, right? And then the king says, "Okay, fine, do it to Mordecai." Now he's stuck. How could he go and take Mordecai, right? With the most noble man. And Achashverosh says, well, you're the most noble person that I know. I want you to be the one to do it. So he says, so then he already changes his tone. He starts saying, I don't think Mordecai really needs that. Maybe we could just give him a nice place to live, a nice house. We'll pay him. He'll live well. Achashverosh said, okay, give that to him too. And then he says, how about we just give him a lot of money? Yeah, give that to him too. And everything that he's saying, Achashverosh says, yeah, give that to him too. That's what it means when he says, do not omit a single detail of all that you have suggested. Meaning all that you have suggested, meaning you keep suggesting more things. Do not omit a single thing that you have suggested. I want you to do everything that you're saying to do. And so, it's sufficient for him to give him one village or one river from which he can collect taxes. So Achashverosh said, do that and do not omit anything. So now he has no choice. So Haman took the garment and the horse, dressed Mordecai, and he had him ride through the city square and proclaim for him, this shall be done to the man for the king desires to honor. Now, the Talmud goes into detail about what happened here. So now Haman took the garments, and what does he have to do? He has to come to Mordecai. Now, what do you think Mordecai was doing? He was sitting and studying, right? He was studying with his sages, and he was praying, right? It was during the time of the fasts. So he was praying, and now Haman comes. So Mordecai sees Haman. He says, "What do you think Mordecai is thinking?" Guys, he's come. That's it. He says, "Guys, go save yourselves. Let me do this." So no, we're staying here. Mordecai then was praying, and Mordecai and Haman sat down with the other sages, sometimes even children that were there, and he started talking to them while Mordecai was praying. And they said to him, they asked him, "What are you talking about? Like, what are you guys discussing?" Like, he's sitting down like a buddy. So what are you guys discussing here? So they said, well, we're talking about the laws of giving a mincha offering, which the mincha offering was basically a handful of wheat for a mincha offering. And why was this relevant? Because this was, if you remember, this was in the month of Nisan, and actually the first fast that was given to them, the fast that they did actually went on the first 2 days of Pesach. That year they did not eat matzah; they fasted on Pesach. And one of the things that we do on Pesach, we bring a meal offering known as the Omer offering. So they said we can no more bring the Omer offering because the temple is destroyed, but we're studying the laws of how to bring the Omer offering. And they talked about the mincha, which is a handful of flour that you bring, which is it's one of the offerings in the Beis Hamikdash. You mix the flour, and it's like a bread offering. So he said, "This is what we're studying." So he said to them, "Your handful of flour has pushed away my 10,000 talents that I had offered the king." Right? He's saying your little handful of flour had got rid of 10,000 talents, which is a nice a lesson that we could learn from Haman himself. That sometimes we think that we have to do big things. Sometimes it's just a little handful of flour. If you do it with all your heart and soul, and you give a proper offering to God, that could get rid of the 10,000 coins that our enemies are trying to offer to destroy us. So then Mordechai finishes praying. So he says, he tells Mordechai what happened. I got to do this. I have no choice. So Mordechai says, "Nuh-uh, you can't do that right now." He says, "What do you mean?" He says, "I'm fasting. I'm sitting in sackcloth and ashes for 3 days. My hair has been growing. That's disrespectful to the king. You want the king to have your head in a second?" He says, "I first need a haircut." "Okay, let's see if we could get you a barber." He looks around, no barbers. He says, "Well, you need a bath. Let's see, can I get you a bath?" Looks out, all the barber shops are closed. Now, why did this happen? Esther, when she found out what's going to be happening, she immediately called to make it a national holiday, and that all stores and everything has to be shut down. So Esther shut down all the barbers, all the bathhouses. Back then, not everyone had a bath in their house. You had to go to the bathhouse. So what happened? So Haman had to now go and do it himself. So he had to give Mordechai a haircut. It's interesting. It says that Haman's family profession was actually barbers, and he knew how to give a haircut. Very interesting. And he was a barber in a city called Kartsum, and for 22 years. Anyway, so he had to himself give Mordechai a haircut, and he had to give him a bath. And now he's ready to go. Mordechai's all cleaned up, looking good. He's wearing the beautiful garments of the king, and he's finally ready to mount the horse. Well, Haman says, "Get up. Get up on the horse." He says, "I can't. I'm too weak. I'm fasting for 3 days." So Haman bent down, and he had to step on Haman in order to get up on the horse. So he says, while he was there, he gave Haman a little kick. And Haman says, "I don't understand. How could you do such a thing? Doesn't it say when your enemy falls, you shouldn't rejoice?" So he said, "That's with regards to a Jew. But with regards to you, it says, and you shall tread on their high places." Okay, now he went in the street, and he starts saying that this is what happens when the king, to the one who king wishes to honor. Now, everyone was watching. This is now a big parade, right? Remember, Esther made it a national holiday. Everyone has to go and watch it, so everyone was there watching this parade. And one of the places he passes is Haman's house. Passes Haman's house, and Haman's daughter is on the roof, and she's watching the parade, and she assumes that she can't see clearly, so she assumes that it's Haman on the horse, and Mordechai is leading him. So she takes a pail of excrement and throws it down, and it lands on Haman's head. When he looks up, she realizes it's her father, so she jumps to her death. That was part of the story. Now, why is that a significant part of the story? Because let's take a look at the next part. Says in the Megillah, you see where it says Haman's humiliation? Verse number 11, page 21. Verse number 11. So Haman took the garment and the horse dressed Mordechai. Verse number 12. Mordechai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried despondent with his head covered. Why? Because he was also in mourning at that time. Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. And the wise men and his wife said, Zeresh said to him, if Mordechai, before whom you have begun to fall, is in Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will undoubtedly fall before him. While they were talking, the king's chamberlains arrived. They hurried to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. So now Haman is sitting, and he's all smelly and dirty, and they bring him like this to the king. Now, what again, he had a smart wife, Zeresh. She was an evil wife, but she was a smart wife. And what did she say? He said, okay, fine. All right, it didn't work out. I messed up this time. I'm gonna do it again. She says, You lost your chance, buddy. This is the Jews you're talking about. Okay? Yes, they may fall. What does it say? That the Jews are compared to the stars and compared to the sand. They're compared to the stars that they could reach the heaven at any time. They're also compared to the sand that they could go. So sometimes they're in the bottom. You tried when they were in the bottom. You didn't prevail. Now they're only going to go up from here. You can't go, once you hit the floor, you can't go further down. So, sorry buddy, you're done. Haman, of course, didn't want to hear that. He refused to hear that. She was trying to say, go revoke your decree and you'll be okay. Of course, he didn't listen to his wife again. So then he came and he says, what is your request? Chapter 7. Esther, what is your request, Esther the queen? Shall grant it to you, and what is your petition? Until half the kingdom shall be fulfilled. So Esther the queen responded and said, if I found favor in the eyes of the king, and it pleases the king, let me be granted to me as my request and my people as a petition. For we have been sold, and my people have been destroyed, to be slain, to be exterminated. I have been sold as slaves and maidservants. I would have kept quiet, but the adversary is not worthy of the king's damage. Thereupon the king Ahasuerus exclaimed and said to the queen of Esther, who is this, and where is the one who dared to do so? And Esther said, a man who is an adversary and an enemy, the wicked Haman. Why she give this introduction? Says that she actually was planning to point to Ahasuerus, because she actually hated him so much as well. And the angel quickly moved her finger away, and she began to say, this evil, wicked man. And quickly turned her finger away and said, the wicked Haman. Haman trembled in terror before the king and queen. The king rose at his wrath from the fine feast and went to his palace garden, where Haman remained to beg Esther the king for his soul. For he saw that evil had been determined against him by the king. When the king returned to his palace garden, the hall of wine feast, Haman had fallen into the couch upon which Esther was so he exclaimed, would he actually assault the queen while I'm in the house? Now it says that he went out to the garden. What happened in the garden? So there were angels that dressed up that were destroying the king's garden. And Ahasuerus said, what are you doing? Why are you destroying my beautiful garden? He said, well, Haman told us to do it. And he came back in, and then another angel, Gabriel, came and pushed Haman on Esther and says, you're trying to attack my queen with me here. And so then Charvona, one of the chamberlains, said, you should know that Haman made a gallows, so hang him on the gallows that he made for Mordechai. And then, V'chamas hamalch shachacha, and the king's anger abated. What does it mean, the king's anger? This also means the heavenly king. Then, eventually, they were given permission to fight back. But before we get to the rest, I want to first go now into what we have discussion here. So remember going back, yeah.
So the Jews know they're about to be slaughtered, and they wait for permission to defend themselves. Like, why would they need permission? Like, if someone's going to come after you, wouldn't you defend yourself? Why would they need the Ahasuerus permission to defend themselves?
Well, I don't know if I would say he was defending himself. It was permission to fight back, to create an army to fight back. So you could say, why didn't they just do that?
Yeah.
You're talking about different times. This is not the United States and to 2023. This is back in the times you were under the rulership of the idea of fighting and.
Is it that they didn't have weapons? Like no.
Well, for sure they didn't have weapons. That's for sure. But the question, even to try and fight back, was it just it wasn't something that occurred back in the day. You know, people didn't think that way.
They had no place to go because
they had nowhere to go.
Ahasuerus ruled the world.
The entire world. There's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to flee. Anyway,
Maybe it's allowed them to.
I know that it's coming from a mindset of a 2023 where we're constantly talking about defending ourselves, but people in those days didn't have that kind of mindset. Yeah.
You said that Esther had declared holiday, and it was my understanding that she had so little standing that she had to wait to be summoned to see the king. So where did her power come from to do something like declaring national?
Well, when you're talking about something between her and the king, but to say that the businesses should shut down, like I don't think that was a thing that was a big deal. To just coming from the top, send out a message. The queen says, I don't think that was like the whole thing was between her and the king. That's you're talking about someone above her, but dealing with people below her, I don't think that was really an issue. It depends what I just don't. I mean, I hear what you're saying, but I'm assuming that it just wasn't a big deal. Like the king didn't care if she makes that kind of decree.
He was crazy in love with her anyhow.
Right. So now we're going to take this to the next dimension. Okay, so let's go to the next page. Medrash Yalkut Shamoni. On that night, the sleep of the king was disturbed. Here, the king refers to Hashem, the king of the world. Omeya, surely Hashem doesn't sleep. How can this refer to Hashem? The answer is as follows. When the Jewish people sin, which is a state of sleeping, Hashem conducts himself like someone who is sleeping. And when they do his will, then the guardian of Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. So what is the message that we're being told here? That when we say, in that night, the king couldn't sleep. Why is that the source of the miracle of Purim? Because it really wasn't talking about the king simply as Achashverosh the king. By the way, it doesn't say God's name in the Megillah. Also, meaning of Esther. The Megillah's Esther, meaning the one that's hidden, where God's name is hidden. So sometimes when it says Hamelach, the king, it's referring to God. So it means that God couldn't sleep on that night. What do you mean God couldn't sleep? What do you mean God never sleeps? So the answer is that sometimes he makes himself like he sleeps, which is unfortunately, when the Jewish people are in a state of sleep themselves, meaning that they are not awake, acting as they should, as a Jew should be acting, then God, so to speak, is in a state of sleep and slumber as well. I threw in a little musar in here. This is from a sefer called Mechir Yayin, where he talks about, he compares the entire story of the Megillah to an individual's life. And he says he wants to say that he had already seen the future, that the forces wanted to educate him, but Mordechai the Jew, which refers to the intellect, got in his way. Therefore, he did not want to pursue any force, only the intellect that is Mordechai. So in other words, what he's saying is that Mordechai refers to the intellect, and Haman and Achashverosh says, I can't sleep, referring to the person when he says, I have to start making the right decisions in life. Sometimes your decisions are made off course, so Mordechai refers to the intellect saying to make that right decision. Anyway, that's just a little musar in there. But says the Zohar, Kabbalah, Ani yashnav li be'er, I'm sleeping, but my heart is awake. Sleeping refers to our Hashem as sleeping in Golus. So when you talk about sleeping, what does it mean sleeping? That God is sleeping is referring to a time of Golus, a time of exile. The sleep from the Torah and mitzvahs causes Hashem to sleep refers to the state of Golus. So what does it mean, God sleeping? In a time of exile, that is what it refers to as a time of Golus. And that's why it's also referred to as nighttime, Balayla Hahu. The word night refers to Galus, refers to exile, as the darkness of night represents the concealment of Galus. Since the time of Purim was a time of Galus, it should have been a time of sleep for Hashem. The fact that Hashem's sleep was disturbed and he didn't deal with the Jews, it would be during the time of Galus, and against the rule of creation, which is why this is the main miracle of Purim. So let's digest what we just read. You guys are reading it too fast? So what are we saying according to the Zohar? What we're saying is like this. On that night, Balayla Hahu. What do we say, Balayla Hahu? What does it mean that night? That night, in a deeper sense, in a mystical sense, the night refers to a time of exile. Why is night referred to exile? Because night refers to a time when the world is dark, when you don't see God's presence, when you don't have a holy temple, when you don't have a godly revelation in the world. And so therefore, it's night, it's dark. So in a time of darkness, in a time of night, normally, you would say that it's a state of slumber, it's a state of sleep. State of slumber means, what's the difference between when you're sleeping and when you're awake? When a person is sleeping, so they're there, they're alive, but they're not in fully functioning mode when you're sleeping. That's what sleep means. Sleep means that everything is there, you're breathing, but you're not functioning. You could think, but you're seeing different things in a dream than you would in your normal conscious way of thinking. In a dream, you could see opposites, things that don't really make sense, because you're not living really in the world of reality when you're sleeping. And so in a time of gullus, in a time of exile, sometimes we think things that this is what reality is, but the truth is that that's not really the way it's supposed to be. The way it's supposed to be is that we have that we're living in a time where you could see God's presence open and revealed. We have a holy temple, living in the land of Israel, living in a time of peace, living in a time of greatness, living in a time of happiness. But in a time of guilt, in a time of exile, sometimes things seem like they're the way they should be, but it's actually like a dream. It's actually like you're sleeping. And so, at that time, when they were exiled from their holy land, this is, by the way, the only major holiday which is from when they came in the land of Israel. The Hanukkah took place during the time of the second temple. The temple was built at the time of Hanukkah. This was actually a time of exile. And they were in a state where they were almost like sleeping. They weren't seeing the reality of life the way it should be. Their temple was destroyed. They're living in a different country. They're being ruled over other kings. It wasn't the life the way it's supposed to be, the way it's meant to be. And therefore, it was a time when they were able to have a sin that caused them to believe that where is my true identity as a Jew, being in the presence of Achashverosh, of the local king, thinking that this is where the true domination of my existence as a Jew is living in Persia, living in the capital, and going to the king's beautiful party. That's it, that's my life, that's what it's at. So that's when everything starts going downhill. So in that case, God is, so to speak, also in a sleep. You don't see God's presence revealed. You don't see a holy temple. You don't see God's godly presence. So what's the miracle of Purim? The miracle of Purim is that on that night, the king couldn't sleep. God couldn't sleep. He wasn't able to see that suddenly God woke up and said, I know that we're in a time of galus, I know that we're in a time of exile, and I know that things have not been going well, I know that you guys have not been acting properly, but nevertheless, you're still my people. Can't take that away. You can try and run, you can't hide. We're still there. We still have that connection. And that is the miracle of Purim in the deeper sense. What's the miracle of Purim? Miracle of Purim, yes, of course, it's about Achashverosh and the king and Haman and all that. But that's the facade of it. That's the forefront of what the story is. What's the real forefront? The real forefront is that the king couldn't sleep. That God is saying, I'm awake, I'm here. Guys, I'm here. You didn't notice me. Haven't been around till now, but hi. Right? I've been trying to call you. You've been ignoring my calls. Here I am. There's an old joke they used to say, which doesn't really exist anymore. But this is like, back in the 80s, they would say, how do you know that Achashverosh had a telephone? Because he gave Haman a ring and then he hung him up. But Well, I guess you could say it was cell phones, but that was back in the day, when you had these landlines. Yeah.
Okay, I understand that during the time that there was no temple, Jews had a very, very hard time observing God's
Right.
laws.
Correct.
Okay, so what did they do? Were they able to do anything other than just pray?
Well, I mean, they did have mitzvahs, just like we have mitzvahs today that we do outside of the temple. But you're right. That was one of the reasons when they went back to the second temple. One of the first things that was done was Ezra reestablished what he called the men of the Great Assembly. They created a form of prayer the way we have it today. Back then, it was just however you prayed, you prayed. He created officially the official prayer the way we have it. He established certain aspects of Jewish culture. But you're right. I mean, there's a lot of things that we don't do today. For example, laws associated with land and ground and meiser, giving tithing, and I mean we do tithing with money, but not like the way it was done then. And so yeah, there was ways to celebrate as a Jew, but you're right. It was more difficult, which is why many Jews assimilated back then.
So if I understand what you're saying, is Ezra gave the Jews some kind of structure.
A structured Judaism,
that
yeah.
they had not had before.
True.
And it made it easier for them.
In a certain sense, yes. Anyway, so this is the idea of that night, and this is why we say that you want to know where the main miracle of Purim is. This is why you have to lift your voice. You have to say the Megillah a little louder. If you're already screaming in a room full of people with 70, 80 people in the room, you have to scream it even louder when you read this part of the Megillah. Why is it? Because the fact that the king's sleep was disturbed, this is the main miracle of Purim. This is what it's about. Yeah.
So it's often said, oh, God is more mentioned in the Megillah, but when they talk about how Esther fasted for 3 days, I mean, isn't it assumed she's fasting to pray to God?
Right. So it means it doesn't say his name. It doesn't mean God's not in the Megillah. It means it doesn't say God's name in the Megillah, but of course, he's alluded to many times. Let's read Chassidus, Lubavitcher Rebbe, 1984. Because the Jews' Mesiras Nefesh, which came from their essence, permeated every individual aspect of that year. Right? Because all that they had to do was say, I'm not Jewish. That's all they had to do. They had to disown their identity as a Jew. But they didn't. They refused to. So that self-sacrifice, Mesiras Nefesh, which came from their essence, permeated every individual aspect of the year. This caused a corresponding reaction above. The essence of godliness, which is beyond creation, the level where godliness ascends to during Hashem's sleep, right? Because we said that sleep is where you're going beyond the reality, beyond the realm of reality. So that permeated all levels within creation. The level of the sleep of the king, the essence of godliness, was disturbed from its place beyond creation and brought into creation. This explains why it says he ordered to bring the books of records, right? That was what Megillah continues on. It says the Chronicles, right after the king's sleep was disturbed. Even though the essence of the godliness is beyond time, when the sleep of the king was disturbed, the essence of godliness was revealed. This permeated the entire creation, including the source of time itself, representing the book of records, Chronicles, with the essence of godliness. This tremendous revelation of the essence of godliness within the source of time resulted in the fact that they found written in the physical book of records that Mordechai had informed the Bigsan of Seresh, who were plotting to assassinate the king, which saved the king's life. This shows that even within the records of the capital of Galus, Shushan, Hashem Shechina was with the Jews, as it says, they, the Jews, were exiled to Elam, Shushan, the Shechina was with them. So what is the Rebbe saying over here? He's saying so we talked about the idea that when you sleep, you're not really in touch with reality. In a deeper sense, that means that you're beyond reality, meaning that you're higher than what the physical existence demands. At that time, the living within the physical realm of reality says that you have the decree of the king. The decree of the king is that every Jew, man, woman, child, on the 13th day of Adar. But then, when you're in a state of sleep, meaning that you're able to reach a place where there could be things that don't make sense. It could be that maybe they were deserving or whatever. But with all that being said, God says, you're still my people. And no matter what, I'm not going to let go. No matter what, I'm not going to leave you or lose you. And then, what happens? Then it says, and they found it written in the book of Chronicles. What does that mean? That ultimately came down that not only was it in a theoretical aspect, God saying that I still have this connection by seeing that you are not willing to give up your identity as a Jew throughout the entire year. Therefore, I'm also not willing to give up my connection with you as your God. Therefore, it also came down in the book of Chronicles, meaning it's also coming down in the physical book of life, meaning the physical book written down in this world, in this physical world, and that's how it affects this physical world as well.
Question. Was the decree from Ahasuerus ever formally reversed?
It wasn't formally reversed. No, it was that they were given the permission and encouragement to fight back, and of course they were able to. But getting to the point over here is that this is also, by the way, why it's called Purim. Why is the holiday called Purim? Because of the lottery. Because what does a lottery mean? A lottery means when you say that I'm not going to make this decision based on my understanding. I'm going to make it on a lot. Lottery means that it's beyond my understanding. Right? In other words, you're reaching a place that is not being dictated by the confines of what your simple understanding of the realm of reality is. That's what a lottery is. That's why Purim is a holiday. And that's why it's called Purim. You say, why is it called Purim on such an evil thing? Haman drawing lottery, that's a really awful way to refer to the holiday. Because of Haman's Haman's lottery? But the truth is no. Because on one hand, it's Haman's lottery, but on the other hand, it's saying the lottery itself, that is what brought about the salvation. Saying that maybe even if in the realm of the physical world that we see it, maybe something should be done in one way. But when you're going in a higher realm, which is, like we mentioned, the idea of sleep, going beyond what the normal what the normal rules of life should be, God says there, just like you are willing to give up everything, put everything on the line and say, I'm not willing to give up my Jewish identity, God says, I'm also not willing to give you up as a people. And that comes down, that's what it says, and he said, come down and write it in the book of Chronicles, meaning that it has to come down in the book of the physical realm of this world, that should come down in that way too. And that is why the miracle is expressed in that way.
Okay, one other. The last two lines of that part says, this shows that even within the records of the capital of Galus, Shushan, Hashem's Shekhinah is with the Jews. And as it says, they, the Jews, were exiled to Shushan. They were exiled to Shushan?
Well, eventually Shushan. I mean, originally it was to Iraq, but eventually it spread out to Iran.
So all the Jews eventually were exiled to Shushan.
It was all in that. It was under different dictatorships.
Why were they exiled?
And after the first temple, they were exiled. Nebuchadnezzar exiled.
This is where they were when all this happened with Ahasuerus and.
Yeah, that's what they. This is 70 years after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash.
So all this happened in Shushan.
In Shushan, yeah, at that time when they were in exile. Yeah, yes.
Approximately how many Jewish people were there in the kingdom
I
at that time?
don't know. I mean, a lot were killed out. A lot were killed out by Nebuchadnezzar, but and a lot had already assimilated because they were sent into exile a good 150 years before the destruction of the temple. So that's what we know of as the 10 lost tribes. That was already then.
All right, well, how was it supposed to happen that all the Jews
No, it was a decree to all nations that all nations have the right to attack the Jews locally,
Oh, okay.
right? Imagine we don't want to imagine it, but so now let's end off with 7 lesson. Purim 5772. This is a lesson from. No, it's supposed to be 5732. This is a lesson from the story of the Megillah. When one encounters a Jew and seems to have this, it seems he should behave differently. Megillah records Haman's words to Achashverosh, Yeshnoi am echad. The nation is asleep, right? Remember we said. This is going back to Haman, saying the king, Yeshna, he tells the king, the nation is asleep, Yeshna am echad. Nation is asleep, because regardless of a Jew's appearance, he is sleeping, is only on the outside. The soul is holy and complete. Recognize that all is a product of sleep. The capacity for godly understanding, sensitivity, and action are perfectly intact and just waiting to be activated. So this is the lesson that he's taking out. That when you see another Jew and you say, he may not be acting the way he should be. It looks like he's in a state of sleep. He's not up and awake. He's not functioning as a Jew the way a Jew should be functioning. He's not doing the things that he should be. So he comes to teach you that we have to learn from the Megillah. Haman also said the Jews are sleeping. And what was Haman? What did Haman want? The Jews are sleeping, so discard them, get rid of them. But the Megillah, the lesson from the Megillah is no. Just because a Jew is asleep, on the contrary, that is the moment that you come in and you're able to bring about the salvation. Reach out to them, help them, wake them up from their slumber, wake them up from their sleep. Do with them a little mitzvah that's going to be able to reawaken their Jewish spirit. So don't look at them and say, yeah, they're sleeping, let's forget it. No, that's the Haman approach. The Jewish approach is, you're sleeping. Good. Let me help you wake up. Right? That's the Jewish approach. And this is a lesson that we have from the Megillah, that the entire miracle of the Megillah is that we're not letting you sleep. We got to wake you up. Sorry we weren't able to get to the rest of the story, but you could read it on your own. Thank you for joining us today. Yes.
With regard to study,